You're about to witness one of history's most calculated acts of psychological warfare. For 76 days, Marie Antoinette wasn't just imprisoned. Her captors methodically dismantled her humanity piece by piece, testing the limits of a human spirit with deliberate cruelty. And it all began with an 8-year-old boy. Forget everything you think you know about the guillotine, the blade often remembered as swift or merciful. What came before the execution was something far darker, far more intimate, because the revolutionaries had discovered her one weakness, and they intended to exploit it mercilessly. This is the story of prisoner 280, and I'm going to show you exactly what they did to her. It's July 3rd, 1793, in the middle of the night at the Temple prison in Paris. The silence of the stone corridors is shattered by boots echoing heavy and purposeful. The sound grows louder, closer, reverberating off damp walls. Marie Antoinette sleeps beside her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, her hand resting on his chest, a silent promise she will never let him go. She hasn't allowed herself to leave his side since the execution of his father, King Louis XVI, 6 months earlier. Then the door bursts open. 6 guards flood into the room, a document in hand, an order from the revolutionary authorities. They are here for the boy. The next hour will transform the former queen from a dignified prisoner into something primal, a mother fighting for her child with every ounce of remaining strength. She throws herself against the door, screaming until her voice cracks. She pleads with them to take her instead, but the men advance, unyielding. Here's what makes the moment worse. This isn't random cruelty. This is calculated. The revolutionaries quickly learned that ordinary methods, torture, starvation, and public humiliation, would not break Marie Antoinette. She survived imprisonment that would crush ordinary prisoners. But her love for her son was a weapon they could use against her. In exploiting that love, they knew they could destroy her in ways far more lasting than any blade could. To understand why this worked, we have to understand who Marie Antoinette really was. The woman imprisoned in 1793 was nothing like the caricature the revolutionaries painted. Born Maria Antonia in Vienna in 1755, she was the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, an Austrian archduchess raised with rigor and expectation. At 14, she was married off to the future King Louis XVI of France, not for love, but for geopolitics. Austria and France required an alliance, and she was the price. From the very beginning, she faced a hostile French court, which mocked her foreign accent, her strange customs, her awkward manners. Her husband ignored her for years, and their marriage was not consummated until she was 21, an humiliation that became fodder for gossip across Europe. Isolated and powerless, she retreated into the pleasures she could control: elaborate hairstyles, costly gowns, and private gatherings at the Petit Trianon. These were minor indulgences, but in the eyes of a starving nation, she became Madame Deficit, the embodiment of royal excess and disregard. Legends like "let them eat cake" may be false, but the damage to her reputation was real and permanent. By 1789, when revolution erupted, she was France's easiest scapegoat: a foreigner, a woman, a queen. 3 reasons enough to mark her for destruction. By 1793, however, Marie Antoinette was no longer a frivolous courtier. She had endured unimaginable loss: the death of her eldest son, the execution of her husband, the collapse of her monarchy. She was imprisoned in the Temple alongside her 2 surviving children, 14-year-old Marie Therese and 8-year-old Louis Charles, under round-the-clock guard. The prison itself was a medieval fortress originally built by the Knights Templar, a cold, damp, and oppressive space designed to break its occupants before any formal trial could begin. At first, she tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, teaching her children, praying with them, holding them close at night as the noises of revolutionary Paris echoed outside. But the guards watched constantly, reporting to the Committee of Public Safety, the revolutionary authority that now controlled the city. They observed closely, noting every gesture, every word, every sign of attachment. And then they discovered the truth. Marie Antoinette could endure nearly anything: solitary confinement, public insults, deprivation, but she could not bear threats to her children. From that knowledge, her captors devised a campaign of psychological torment more precise and deliberate than any physical torture they could impose. Every threat, every manipulation, every fear was designed to exploit the bond between mother and child, to turn her love into a weapon against her own sanity. They knew she would fight to the death for Louis Charles, and so they began the slow, systematic dismantling of her resolve through the most intimate form of cruelty possible, targeting the very heart of her maternal instinct. This was the beginning of the most harrowing chapter in the downfall of Marie Antoinette, a queen stripped of power, dignity, and finally, the illusion that even her children could protect her. First, the revolutionaries restricted access to the children's rooms, forcing Marie Antoinette to beg just to see her own son and daughter. Guards were installed inside their quarters, men who sat in corners, watching, recording everything. Every word, every moment of tenderness, every tear. The children were forbidden to speak German, their mother's native language, and were compelled to use French exclusively, turning even private moments into opportunities for state surveillance and control. Marie Antoinette began to unravel under the relentless pressure. Her light brown hair rapidly turned white from stress, a condition historians sometimes call Marie Antoinette syndrome, which is documented in medical literature as a form of acute stress-induced graying. She stopped eating, her body weakened, and she developed hemorrhages she desperately tried to hide from the guards, yet she clung to life for one reason alone: her children. The revolutionaries, however, had identified this bond as her weakness and knew that to break her, they would have to remove what she loved most. That fateful night, July 3, 1793, would define the beginning of her final torment. Around 10 p.m., Marie Antoinette had just put her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, to bed. He slept in the same room as her, as he had every night since his father's execution 6 months prior. Her daughter, Marie Therese, and her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, were in adjacent rooms. Then came the sound that would forever haunt the former queen. Heavy boots pounding up the tower stairs. The door exploded open. 6 municipal guards, led by a man bearing an official decree from the Committee of Public Safety, stormed the room. They had come to seize Louis Charles, claiming he would be re-educated by the Republic, separated from his mother's corrupting influence. Marie Therese later described the scene in her memoirs, recalling how her mother transformed from composed to feral in an instant. Marie Antoinette threw herself in front of her sleeping son, holding him so tightly he awoke screaming and confused, and she began to scream herself. This was no elegant objection from a dethroned queen. This was raw, animalistic, desperate, a mother's scream that shook stone walls. "You will not take him. You will have to kill me first. He's just a child." The guards attempted reasoning, insisting the order came from the highest authority, that compliance was mandatory, but she refused. For a full hour, 60 minutes, she physically blocked the doorway, refusing to release her son. The guards threatened her, threatened the children, threatened violence. Marie Antoinette remained unyielding. At last, Madame Elizabeth begged her sister-in-law to relent. The boy was terrified, Marie Therese hysterical, and the guards increasingly violent. Marie Antoinette kissed Louis Charles one final time, whispered something in his ear that no one would ever know, and watched as 6 grown men dragged her son down the tower stairs, his screams echoing until they faded into silence. She collapsed on the floor, motionless, overwhelmed by shock, grief, and helplessness. Yet the cruelty was only beginning. The revolutionaries didn't merely remove her son, they handed him over to Antoine Simon, a radical cobbler chosen for his brutality and ideological zeal. Simon's methods were horrifying. Louis Charles was confined to a dark, windowless room, forced to wear the red revolutionary cap and sing anti-monarchist songs. He was instructed to curse his mother, call her vile names, and repeat accusations of treason and conspiracy. When he refused, Simon beat him, starved him, and placed him in total isolation until the boy's spirit was gradually broken. Within weeks, Louis Charles repeated the indoctrinated lies and slander against his mother, accusations so monstrous that they would be used as propaganda to further destroy her reputation and morale. Marie Antoinette knew her son suffered, yet she was powerless to intervene. The psychological torment continued as her captivity escalated. On August 1, 1793, less than a month after the abduction of Louis Charles, guards entered her room at the Temple prison at 2 a.m. Giving no explanation, only an order, she was being transferred. Separated from her daughter and sister-in-law, she pleaded for the chance to say goodbye, but her pleas were ignored. She was dragged down the stairs, thrown into a carriage, and driven through the darkened streets of Paris to the Conciergerie, a notorious prison. For anyone familiar with the revolution, the Conciergerie was synonymous with impending death, the antechamber to the guillotine. Marie Antoinette's transfer was not mere imprisonment. It was preparation for execution, Yet the revolutionaries aimed to make those final days as psychologically devastating as possible. Assigned prisoner number 280, she was stripped of identity, her name erased from official records. Her cell was a tiny, oppressive space, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, the walls damp and mold-covered. No comfort, no reprieve, no familiarity remained. Every detail of her environment was designed to amplify isolation, fear, and despair. The child she loved had been stolen, her home stripped of freedom, and the mechanisms of state power now dictated every second of her existence. Within these walls, she would face not only physical confinement but relentless psychological torment, a carefully calculated campaign intended to crush her spirit and break her will, all while keeping her alive enough to suffer the full weight of her loss. Her story, already marked by resilience, was about to enter its darkest chapter. A 76-day ordeal of dehumanization, manipulation, and deliberate cruelty orchestrated by those who understood that her love for her children was both her greatest strength and her ultimate vulnerability. There was a thin straw mattress on the stone floor, a small wooden table, 2 chairs, and a chamber pot. A single candle provided the only light, casting flickering shadows across damp, mold-covered walls. No windows existed, just the suffocating darkness of the medieval dungeon. Yet the revolutionaries added a cruel layer of deception. They provided a folding privacy screen, ostensibly so Marie Antoinette could change her clothes or use the chamber pot without exposure. At first glance, it seemed humane, almost considerate. But it was theater. Behind that screen, 2 armed guards were always present, seated in corners, eyes unblinking, watching her every movement. When she ate, when she slept, when she prayed, when she wept, when she changed clothes or used the chamber pot, they recorded every detail. This wasn't about security. Marie Antoinette was a middle-aged woman in fragile health, confined to a dungeon. The purpose was psychological torture, to strip her of dignity, privacy, and humanity. Historical accounts describe how she tried to maintain composure. Hours passed as she sat staring at a blank wall, her face empty of expression. The guards reported that she barely spoke, barely moved, and ate little. But at night, when she thought the dim candlelight obscured her, they heard her quiet, desperate whispers. Louis Charles, repeating her son's name over and over. The stress and malnutrition took a brutal toll. She developed severe hemorrhaging, likely a complication of uterine disease exacerbated by stress, bleeding through her clothes. She had to request rags from the guards, a humiliation endured in the gaze of men who showed no mercy. Her hair, now completely white, fell out in clumps. At 37, she looked 60. Every day, the prison system attempted to reduce her to nothing, yet she persisted. Finally, the Revolutionary Tribunal arrived to deliver what they called justice. October 14, 1793, 8 a.m. Marie Antoinette was dragged from her cell to the courtroom, a space designed more for spectacle than judgment. The verdict had already been decided. The trial was a performance, intended to humiliate and justify her execution to the public and posterity. The courtroom was packed with revolutionary officials, journalists, and citizens eager to witness the former queen's degradation. Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, the prosecutor, presented charges ranging from treason to conspiracy to financial corruption. Marie Antoinette, pale, gaunt, dressed in widow's black, responded to the accusations with intelligence, composure, and dignity. She refuted false claims, admitted to minor mistakes without groveling, and refused to allow herself to be broken. The trial lasted 2 days. Then, Fouquier-Tinville played his most cruel card. He called Jacques Wiebert, a radical journalist, as a witness, and the man repeated accusations allegedly extracted from her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles, under coercion. The claims were obscene. Marie Antoinette was accused of sexually abusing her own child. Let that sink in. In front of hundreds, the former queen was confronted with monstrous lies invented by the state, weaponizing her son against her. The courtroom went silent. Even the bloodthirsty mob appeared stunned. Marie Antoinette, who had endured insults, humiliation, and starvation, faltered. Her voice, calm until now, cracked with raw emotion. "I appeal to all the mothers present in this room," she said, eyes blazing, directing her words not to the judges, but to the women in the audience, mothers, daughters, sisters. "Is there among you a single one who would not shudder at such an accusation?" For the first time, she spoke not as a queen, not as a political figure, but as a mother whose child had been turned into a weapon against her. Her words struck at the very humanity of those present. Some women in the crowd, who had come to witness her downfall, were moved to tears. Even some revolutionary officials shifted uncomfortably. But Fouquier Tinville pressed on, indifferent to the audience's reaction. He steamrolled through the remaining charges. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, after less than 2 days of a trial with no real evidence, Marie Antoinette was found guilty of high treason and crimes against the state. The sentence was death by guillotine, scheduled for later that same day. She was returned to her cell for a few hours to prepare. Dawn approached, and death loomed only hours away. In the stillness, she was finally allowed pen, paper, and ink. But she did not write political diatribes, did not curse the revolution, did not beg for mercy. Instead, she wrote to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, who remained imprisoned at the Temple alongside Marie Therese, her daughter. The letter is one of the most heartbreaking documents in history, capturing her humanity, dignity, and concern for family even in the shadow of death. "It is to you, sister, that I write for the last time," she began, every word infused with the knowledge that this was her final act of communication, a testament to love and courage in the face of cruelty. Her cell, the dungeon, the guards, and the constant surveillance had failed to strip her of what was essential: her will, her intelligence, her maternal love. Though her body had endured months of physical deprivation, her mind remained sharp, her spirit unbroken. The revolution could execute her, but it could not erase the strength and dignity she displayed until her last breath. Marie Antoinette's final letters, her calm acceptance of fate, and her concern for her family stand in stark contrast to the calculated cruelty she endured. From a small, windowless cell, under constant guard and surveillance, she demonstrated resilience that would echo across centuries. The psychological torment, the weaponization of her son, and the total control over every aspect of her life were intended to crush her, yet they instead highlighted the depth of her courage. Her letters, her words, and her composure in the courtroom became enduring symbols of resistance, maternal love, and humanity in the face of unimaginable oppression. The Revolutionary Tribunal may have sentenced her body to death, but Marie Antoinette ensured her spirit would survive, leaving behind a legacy of strength, dignity, and maternal courage that continues to resonate through history. "I have just been condemned, not to a shameful death, that is only for criminals, but to rejoin your brother, innocent like him. I hope to show the same firmness in my last moments. I am calm, as one is when one's conscience reproaches one with nothing. I deeply regret having to abandon my poor children. You know that I lived only for them and for you, my good and tender sister." Marie Antoinette's words, written in her final letter, poured every ounce of her remaining love onto the page. She forgave her enemies, asked pardon for any wrongs she may have committed, and implored her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, to care for her children. She reminded her son to never seek revenge for their deaths. For pages of heartfelt prose, signed simply, Marie Antoinette. But the devastating truth is that the letter was never delivered. Her jailers intercepted it, and it vanished into revolutionary archives. Madame Elizabeth never read it. Neither did her daughter. Her final words to her family were silenced for decades, surviving only to remind history of the cruelty that sought to erase her entirely. On October 16, 1793, at 11 a.m., the executioner's assistant entered her cell and ordered her to prepare for death. Every step was a deliberate act to strip away what little remained of her identity. First, the dress. Marie Antoinette wore a simple black mourning gown she had kept since her husband's death. The guard ordered her to remove it and don a plain white chemise, the uniform of the condemned. She requested privacy to change. It was refused. She was forced to undress in front of the very men who had watched her every move for months. Second, her hair. Once light brown, now completely white and brittle, it was crudely hacked off with shears. No ceremony, no compassion, just rough hands, sharp blades, and the erasure of one of her last physical dignities. Third, the binding. Her hands were tied behind her back with coarse rope, so tightly that it cut into her wrists. She flinched and murmured, "You did not bind my husband this way," but the guard ignored her. At 11 a.m., she was led out into blinding daylight. She had spent 76 days in darkness, and the sun hurt her eyes. She expected a closed carriage, the small mercy her husband had received. Instead, they placed her in a rough, open wooden cart, a tumbrel normally used for transporting animal carcasses. She had to sit on a plank, hands bound, exposed to the entire city of Paris. Thousands lined the streets, screaming, jeering, spitting, and hurling garbage. One man, the revolutionary artist Jack Lewis David, sketched her in the cart. His drawing survives. It shows a thin, hollow-eyed woman sitting rigidly upright, her face a mask of grim dignity, as the world howled for her blood. The journey to the Place de la Revolution took over an hour. Each second of public humiliation meant to destroy her spirit. Yet it did not work. At 12:15 p.m., the cart arrived at the guillotine. The crowd roared. Marie Antoinette climbed the steps of the scaffold without assistance, her legs shaking, but her head held high. And then, in the surreal final moments, something extraordinary occurred. As she stepped forward onto the plank, she accidentally trod on the executioner's foot. She paused, turned to him, and spoke her last words. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." A simple apology to the man about to end her life, a final act of courtesy, grace, and choice. Even in the face of total degradation, she chose dignity. 20 seconds later, the blade fell. The revolution had sought to destroy Marie Antoinette, the symbol, the Austrian foreigner, the wasteful queen, the embodiment of royal excess. They weaponized her own child against her, stripped her of privacy, comfort, and dignity, and subjected her to unimaginable psychological torment. They aimed to erase her identity entirely. And yet they failed. In the midst of orchestrated cruelty, Marie Antoinette revealed the human being beneath the crown. A mother who had fought for her children, a woman who faced monstrous lies and accusations with composure, and a person who, even on the steps of the guillotine, held on to her humanity. The revolution wanted her remembered as Madame Capet, a traitor deserving of every indignity inflicted upon her. Instead, history remembers Marie Antoinette as a woman who endured 76 days of calculated psychological torture and still found the grace to apologize to her executioner. A mother whose courage became immortal, a human being who retained her dignity when every system of power sought to strip it away. Her story demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit in the face of organized cruelty and the ability to preserve compassion even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Marie Antoinette's final moments, her letters, and the grace she displayed on the scaffold ensure that her voice continues to resonate through history. She faced total loss, her husband, her children, her freedom, her life, and yet chose composure, love, and humanity in the face of absolute cruelty. The revolutionaries may have executed her body, but they could not destroy her legacy. Today, we remember Marie Antoinette not as the emblem of decadence her enemies painted, but as a mother, a sister, and a human being whose strength and dignity in the darkest hours serve as a lasting testament to courage and resilience. If this story moved you, reflect on her endurance, her grace, and the resilience she displayed in 76 days of relentless torment. She could not prevent her execution, yet she shaped how history would remember her. Always as Marie Antoinette, a woman who faced unimaginable suffering and retained her humanity to the very end. In her final act, she turned cruelty into testimony, injustice into history, and terror into an enduring lesson on the power of grace under fire.